The hum of conversation filled Sarah's diner, a small but beloved eatery in Ridgefield, a quiet town nestled between rolling hills. The lunch rush had passed, and the late afternoon brought a comfortable lull. Jack Colton sat in the corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone lukewarm. At 6'6" and built like a statue carved from stone, Jack wasn't the kind of man who went unnoticed. Yet, he seemed to shrink into his worn leather jacket, his graying beard and streaked hair framing a face etched with quiet resolve. For Jack, Ridgefield was just another stop on a journey that had no clear destination. A retired Green Beret with 20 years of service, he had spent the past few years drifting from town to town, taking odd jobs, and volunteering at veteran shelters. Peace had eluded him since leaving the military, and he'd stopped actively searching for it. As he raised the coffee cup to his lips, the diner's glass door swung open with a clang, shattering the stillness. A group of bikers, 7 in total, stomped in with the swagger of men used to getting what they wanted. Their leader, a wiry man with a dark scowl and tattoos climbing his neck, surveyed the room like a predator. "Axel Grant," muttered Rachel, the waitress, as she froze mid-step. The name was whispered in Ridgefield like a curse. Axel's gang, the Black Horns, had a reputation for intimidation and petty crime, though they rarely came to Sarah's. Jack watched as Axel and his crew claimed the center of the diner. The heavy boots and jingling chains of the bikers made Rachel flinch as she hurried back behind the counter. Axel leaned casually against the counter, tapping the bell with mockery. "Service here as slow as the rest of this dump?" Axel sneered, his voice cutting through the diner like a knife. "Can I help you?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but her hands trembling. Axel smirked, reaching for a sugar dispenser and spinning it in his hand. "Yeah, sweetheart. You can pour me a cup of coffee, and maybe bring me the specials while you're at it." The rest of the gang chuckled, their laughter harsh and grating. One of them, a stocky brute with a face like a bulldog, deliberately tipped over the napkin holder on the counter. The clatter made Rachel jump. Jack set his coffee cup down, his sharp blue-gray eyes flicking from Axel to the rest of the bikers. They moved with the coordination of men who'd done this kind of thing before. Axel was the leader, clearly. The stocky one was muscle, while a younger man with jittery hands and a nervous grin stood out as the most likely to start trouble. "Leave her alone," a voice called softly from the back booth. It belonged to a teenage boy sitting with his grandmother, his face pale but his expression defiant. Axel turned his head slowly, the smirk never leaving his face. "What's that, kid? Got something to say to me?" The boy opened his mouth to respond, but his grandmother placed a firm hand on his arm. "Don't," she whispered. Jack's jaw tightened as Axel strolled toward the boy's booth, the gang falling silent. The boy's grandmother looked up at the approaching man with thinly veiled fear. "Your mama ever teach you manners?" Axel asked, leaning in closer. The boy's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't speak. Jack stood, his movement deliberate. The room seemed to shrink as his massive frame unfolded. He took a single step forward, the faint creak of the floor under his boots drawing every eye to him. "That's enough," Jack said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. Axel turned, raising an eyebrow as he took in Jack's towering figure. His smirk wavered, but only for a second. "And who are you, old man? Think you can take us all by yourself?" "I don't think," Jack replied evenly. "I know." The gang exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond. Axel chuckled, shaking his head. "Big talk, but talk's cheap." He snapped his fingers, and the jittery young man stepped forward, pulling out a switchblade with a flick. The blade gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Jack's eyes didn't leave Axel. "Put it away," he said. The young man lunged. Jack moved faster than anyone expected. His hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist and twisting sharply. The knife clattered to the floor. In the same motion, Jack swept the man's legs out from under him, sending him sprawling into a booth. The stocky brute charged next, swinging wild punches. Jack sidestepped the first blow and caught the second, using the man's momentum to flip him over his shoulder. The thug hit the ground hard, groaning as he clutched his ribs. Axel reached for a gun tucked under his vest, but Jack was already closing the distance. He grabbed Axel's wrist and twisted until the revolver fell. Axel swung wildly with his free hand, but Jack ducked under the blow and shoved him backward into a table. The remaining bikers froze, their confidence shattered. Jack stood tall, his expression calm and unshaken. "You've got two choices," he said. "Walk out of here now, or find out how much worse this can get." Axel groaned as he staggered to his feet, glaring at Jack. "This ain't over," he growled. Jack's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, it is." The gang shuffled out, dragging their injured comrades. The diner erupted into scattered applause as the door swung shut. Jack ignored it, returning to his booth and picking up his coffee. Rachel approached cautiously, her hands trembling as she refilled his cup. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what we'd have done if you hadn't been here." Jack nodded, his voice steady. "No one should have to put up with that." The diner returned to its quiet hum, but the tension from the earlier confrontation still lingered in the air. Jack finished his coffee, left a generous tip, and stepped outside. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the town of Ridgefield, and Jack took a moment to breathe it in. He preferred towns like this, small, unassuming, and far from the noise of larger cities. Unbeknownst to him, the confrontation inside the diner had not gone unnoticed. A young man sitting by the window had filmed the entire scene on his phone, capturing every word, every movement, and every moment of Jack's calm but decisive action. By the time Jack made it back to his small rental house on the edge of town, the video had already begun to spread online. It started with a single post. "This man just stood up to a gang of bikers at Sarah's diner. Absolute legend." The clip had everything a viral sensation needed: drama, tension, and an unlikely hero. Jack's phone buzzed incessantly as notifications began piling up. Text from acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in years, emails from strangers, and calls from unknown numbers all clamored for his attention. He ignored them, setting the phone on his kitchen counter as he poured himself a glass of water. The peace he had sought for years was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't like it. By morning, the video had gone viral. News outlets picked it up, headlines praising Jack's bravery and composure. "A quiet hero defends a small-town diner. Green Beret veteran shows what it means to stand up for justice." The man who took on a gang with calm and strength. Jack sat at the small dining table in his kitchen, scrolling through the flood of articles and comments on his laptop. People were calling him a hero, a protector, a force of nature. It felt surreal. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Rachel, the waitress from the diner, standing on his porch with a nervous smile. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she said. "Not at all," Jack replied, stepping aside to let her in. Rachel hesitated before speaking, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "I just wanted to say thank you again. What you did back there, it wasn't just brave. It was kind." Jack nodded, leaning against the kitchen counter. "You don't have to thank me, Rachel. It was the right thing to do." Rachel smiled faintly. "Well, the whole town's talking about it now. And that video? Have you seen it?" Jack sighed, gesturing toward his laptop. "Hard to miss." Rachel bit her lip. "I don't know if you realize it, but you've inspired a lot of people. Folks in town are already talking about organizing a fundraiser to fix up the diner after what those bikers did. It's because of you." The town of Ridgefield was thriving in ways it hadn't in years. The diner had been repaired and was now a hub of activity. The shelter, boosted by Jack's reluctant fame, was expanding its services. Jack himself was busier than he'd been since his military days, teaching classes, mentoring troubled youth, and working with Marcus to establish new programs. But as Jack knew all too well, peace is often short-lived. It started with small things. A flat tire on his truck one morning, the valve stem sliced cleanly. A brick through the window of the shelter late at night. Graffiti scrawled on the diner's back wall, a crude horn skull that Ridgefield's residents immediately recognized as the symbol of Axel Grant's gang. The messages were clear. The Black Horns hadn't forgotten their humiliation. One afternoon, Jack was in the middle of a self-defense class at the community center when Sheriff Laura Bennett arrived. Her expression was grim as she motioned for him to step outside. "We need to talk," she said, crossing her arms. Jack followed her to her cruiser, where she leaned against the hood. "Axel Grant's been spotted in the area," she said. "We've received reports of his gang causing trouble on the outskirts of town. Vandalism, theft, intimidation. It's only a matter of time before they escalate." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "They're trying to send a message." "Exactly," Laura said. "And if I know Axel, he won't stop until he feels like he's gotten even. I need you to be careful." Jack's gaze hardened. "I can handle myself." "I don't doubt that," Laura said. "But this isn't just about you anymore. The town looks up to you. If Axel thinks he can hurt you by going after them, he will." The warning weighed on Jack as he returned to the shelter. Inside, Marcus was reviewing a list of new volunteers, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Something on your mind?" Marcus asked, glancing up. "Axel's back," Jack said bluntly. Marcus sighed, setting the list aside. "I figured it was only a matter of time. What's the plan?" Jack crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "We stay vigilant. If they come looking for trouble, we'll deal with it." "That's not much of a plan," Marcus said, his tone dry. "It's all I've got for now," Jack admitted. Later that night, Jack was sitting on his porch, the cool breeze rustling the trees, when he heard the sound of approaching motorcycles. His muscles tensed as the rumble grew louder, headlights piercing the darkness. The black horns didn't stop at his house, but they slowed enough to make their presence known. Axel himself sat at the head of the group, his smirk visible even in the dim light. He raised a hand in a mock salute before speeding off, his gang following close behind. Jack watched them disappear, his jaw clenched. The next morning, Ridgefield woke to find the diner's windows smashed again, along with the shelter's front door. Spray-painted messages littered the buildings. "This isn't over." The vandalism sparked outrage in the town. Rachel and Frank from the diner were among the first to speak out, calling for unity and support for Jack and the shelter. Marcus, ever the diplomat, organized a community meeting to address the escalating threats. At the meeting, emotions ran high. Some residents were angry, demanding that Axel's gang be dealt with forcefully. Others were frightened, worried about the safety of their families. Jack stood quietly at the back of the room, listening to the heated discussion. When Marcus finally called for calm, all eyes turned to Jack. "You've been quiet, Jack," Marcus said. "What do you think we should do?" Jack stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "I think we need to be smart," he said. "Axel and his gang want us to react. They want chaos. We can't give them that. We need to stand together, but we also need to trust the law." Laura Bennett nodded, stepping up beside him. "Jack's right. My deputies and I are doing everything we can to track these guys down. But we need your help. Report anything suspicious, and don't try to handle this on your own." The room murmured in agreement, the tension easing slightly. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the town remained on edge. Jack doubled down on his efforts at the shelter, working with Marcus to fortify the building and ensure the safety of everyone involved. Sheriff Bennett increased patrols, determined to prevent further incidents. But Axel wasn't done. One night, Jack returned home from the shelter to find his front porch in flames. A hastily thrown Molotov cocktail had ignited the wooden boards, and the fire was spreading rapidly. Jack acted quickly, grabbing a hose and dousing the flames before they could consume the house. When the fire was out, he spotted a message scrawled on the side of his truck in red paint. "Next time, we won't miss." The attack was a turning point. Jack realized that Axel wasn't just targeting him. He was trying to terrorize the entire town. He met with Marcus and Laura the following morning, outlining a plan. "If Axel wants a fight, we'll give him one," Jack said. "But on our terms." "What do you have in mind?" Laura asked, her eyes narrowing. "We set a trap," Jack replied. "We make them think they have the upper hand, and when they show up, we'll be ready." Laura hesitated. "That's risky, Jack." "So is waiting for them to strike again," Jack said. As the town rallied behind Jack's plan, a new sense of purpose filled Ridgefield. Volunteers worked tirelessly to secure key locations, fortify the shelter, and coordinate with Laura's deputies. Jack used his military training to prepare them, ensuring that everyone knew their role. For the first time, the people of Ridgefield weren't just reacting. They were taking control of their own fate. And as the sun set on another tense day, Jack stood at the shelter's entrance, watching the horizon. He knew Axel's next move was coming. The only question was when. The air in Ridgefield carried a sense of unease, like the calm before a storm. Jack stood in the center of the shelter, surrounded by Marcus and a handful of volunteers. They were finalizing preparations for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. Sheriff Laura Bennett had deputized a few trusted locals, and patrols had been set up around town. Axel Grant and his Black Horns had gone quiet in the past few days, but Jack knew better than to mistake silence for retreat. The shelter bustled with activity. Jack had turned one of the empty offices into a makeshift planning room, its walls now covered with maps of Ridgefield and notes on key locations to defend. Marcus was briefing a group of volunteers when the shelter's door opened, and a young man walked in hesitantly. Jack turned to see a familiar face, Trevor, one of Axel's younger recruits. He was barely in his 20s, his skinny frame hidden under a worn leather jacket with the gang's insignia. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides. "What are you doing here, Trevor?" Jack asked, his voice calm but firm. Trevor swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the room. I want out," he said finally. "I'm done with Axel. I don't want to be part of this anymore." Marcus stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "And why should we trust you?" "Because I've seen enough," Trevor said, his voice trembling. "Axel's gone too far. He's planning something big, something that could hurt a lot of people. I don't want to be a part of it." Jack studied the young man carefully. His instincts, honed by years in the field, told him that Trevor was telling the truth. "Talk," Jack said. "What's Axel planning?" Trevor hesitated before answering. "He's coming for the shelter. He thinks if he takes this place down, it'll send a message. He's got most of the gang ready to hit you tonight." Marcus swore under his breath, but Jack remained composed. "Why tell us?" he asked. "Because I don't want anyone getting hurt," Trevor said. "And because I think you can stop him." Trevor's information set the town into motion. Jack and Marcus worked quickly to fortify the shelter, while Laura coordinated her deputies to cover key access points. The volunteers, many of whom had never faced anything more dangerous than a rowdy neighbor, were nervous but determined. Jack spent the afternoon training them in basic defense strategies, focusing on teamwork and discipline. He reminded them that they weren't alone, that standing together was their greatest strength. By nightfall, the shelter was ready. Windows were boarded up, and volunteers were stationed at every entrance. Sheriff Bennett and her deputies patrolled the perimeter, while Marcus and Jack stood at the shelter's main entrance, their presence a steadying force for the others. The attack came just after midnight. The sound of motorcycles shattered the stillness, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Axel's gang rolled into the parking lot in a show of force, their numbers greater than Jack had anticipated. Axel dismounted his bike, his smirk illuminated by the harsh glow of the streetlights. "Jack Colton," he called out, his voice carrying across the lot. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long." Jack stepped forward, his imposing figure framed by the shelter's entrance. "You've got a choice, Axel," he said evenly. "Turn around and leave, or face the consequences." Axel laughed, the sound cruel and mocking. "You think you can scare me? You're outnumbered, old man." "Maybe," Jack said, "but I'm not the one who should be scared." Axel's smirk faltered as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Sheriff Bennett had called for backup, and reinforcements were closing in. "Last chance, Axel," Jack said. Axel's expression darkened. "Get him," he shouted, and the gang surged forward. The next few moments were chaos. Axel's men attempted to breach the shelter, but the volunteers held their ground. Jack moved through the fray with practiced precision, disarming and subduing attackers without unnecessary violence. Marcus coordinated the volunteers, ensuring they stayed focused and protected. Sheriff Bennett and her deputies arrived in force, surrounding the gang and cutting off their escape routes. Axel fought viciously, his rage driving him to take on Jack directly. The two clashed in the parking lot, Axel swinging wildly while Jack remained calm and deliberate. Finally, Jack disarmed Axel and brought him to his knees, his strength overpowering the gang leader's fury. "You've lost," Jack said, his voice steady. Axel glared up at him, his defiance fading as he realized the truth. The gang was beaten, and the authorities had the situation under control. By dawn, the chaos had subsided. Axel and his gang were in custody, and Ridgefield was safe once again. The volunteers, though shaken, stood together, their sense of accomplishment outweighing their fear. Trevor stayed behind to help clean up the shelter, his presence a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, redemption was possible. "You did good tonight," Jack said as they worked side by side. Trevor nodded. "I just want to make things right." "You've taken the first step," Jack said. "That's what matters." As the sun rose over Ridgefield, Jack looked around at the people he had come to care about, the volunteers, the deputies, Marcus, and even Trevor. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope that peace might finally be within reach. The aftermath of the Black Horn's attempted assault on the shelter left Ridgefield shaken but resolute. Axel Grant and his crew had been arrested, thanks to the combined efforts of Sheriff Laura Bennett, Jack Colton, and the volunteers. The shelter bore a few scars, broken windows, scattered debris, but the damage was manageable, a testament to the town's unity and preparation. Jack sat on the steps of the shelter the morning after, exhaustion etched into his features. Marcus handed him a cup of coffee, sitting down beside him. "You look like you've been through the ringer," Marcus said. Jack smirked faintly. "You should see the other guy." Marcus chuckled, but his tone turned serious. "We did something good last night. But you know this isn't over, right? Axel may be in jail, but there are others like him out there. People who won't hesitate to exploit the vulnerable." Jack nodded, staring out at the horizon. "I know. We've proven we can defend what we've built. Now we need to make sure it lasts." As Ridgefield began to recover, word of what had happened spread beyond the town. News outlets covered the failed assault, emphasizing the bravery of the community and the leadership of Jack Colton. Donations to the shelter surged, and volunteers from neighboring towns began offering their help. But Jack remained cautious. While the immediate threat had been neutralized, he understood that the battle for lasting change was just beginning. One afternoon, a visitor arrived at the shelter, Axel Grant's younger brother, Evan. Unlike Axel, Evan lacked the swagger and menace of a hardened gang leader. He stood awkwardly at the shelter's entrance, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. Jack approached him, his expression unreadable. "Evan, didn't expect to see you here." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Evan said quickly. I wanted to talk." Jack crossed his arms, waiting. "Axel's gone," Evan said, his voice low. "The gang's falling apart. Some of the guys want to turn things around, but they don't know how." "And you?" Jack asked. Evan hesitated. "I'm tired of this life. I've seen what it does to people. Axel always said it was about power, about respect. But all it's done is hurt the people I care about. I don't want to end up like him." Jack studied the young man, searching for signs of deception. He saw none, only desperation and a glimmer of hope. "If you're serious about changing," Jack said finally, "we can help, but you have to commit. No half measures." Evan nodded earnestly. "I'm ready." Evan's arrival marked the beginning of a new initiative at the shelter, a program designed to help former gang members transition to a better life. Jack and Marcus worked tirelessly to develop resources, from job training to counseling, aimed at breaking the cycle of violence and providing a path forward. Trevor, the young man who had defected from Axel's gang, became one of the program's first success stories. With Jack's guidance, he found steady work at a local repair shop and began mentoring other young men who were at risk of falling into the same traps he had. The program faced challenges, from skepticism within the community to pushback from those who doubted the sincerity of participants like Evan. But Jack's reputation and quiet determination helped win over doubters. Amid the progress, Jack received an unexpected visitor, Sheriff Laura Bennett. She arrived at the shelter one evening, her expression unreadable. "Got a minute?" she asked. Jack nodded, leading her to a quiet corner of the shelter. "I wanted to thank you," Laura said, "for everything you've done for this town. I don't think Ridgefield would have made it through this without you." Jack shrugged. "It wasn't just me. The town came together." Laura smiled faintly. "That's true. But it started with you. And now, there's something else I need to talk to you about." Jack raised an eyebrow. There's a group of us, sheriffs, community leaders, people like Marcus, who've been discussing ways to expand what you've built here. There are other towns facing the same challenges, and they could use someone like you to help them get started. Jack leaned back, considering her words. You're asking me to leave Ridgefield? Not permanently, Laura said. But you've got something special, Jack. A way of bringing people together. I think you could do a lot of good beyond this town. Jack spent the next few days wrestling with the decision. He had come to Ridgefield looking for peace, and instead, he had found a purpose. But Laura's words had struck a chord. If he could help more people, bring the same sense of unity and hope to other communities, didn't he have a responsibility to try? He sought advice from Marcus, who listened patiently before responding. You've already proven you can make a difference, Marcus said, but you don't have to do it alone. If you decide to expand this, we'll be with you every step of the way. Jack nodded, appreciating the support. 1 week later, Jack stood in the shelter's main room, addressing a gathering of volunteers, community members, and program participants. I came here looking for a quiet life, he began. I didn't expect to find myself in the middle of something like this, but over the past few months, I've seen what can happen when people come together to stand up for what's right. You've shown me that strength isn't about power, it's about lifting each other up. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. I've been asked to help expand what we've built here to other towns. It's not an easy decision, but I think it's the right one. This community will always have my heart, and I'll be back. But for now, I need to take what we've started and share it with others. The room erupted into applause, a mixture of pride and sadness. Jack felt a swell of emotion as he looked out at the faces before him, the people who had become his family. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. Months had passed since Jack Colton made the decision to take the Ridgefield model of community rebuilding and expand it to other towns. What began as a modest initiative to support veterans and troubled individuals had grown into a full-fledged national movement. Jack found himself traveling across the country, meeting with town leaders, veterans organizations, and law enforcement officials. Each new chapter of the program brought its own challenges, but it also brought hope to places that had long been forgotten. Jack stood in the middle of a bustling garage in a neighboring state, now transformed into a community center. The walls were lined with photographs of families, handwritten thank you notes, and framed news articles celebrating the movement's impact. Former gang members worked side by side with veterans, restoring motorcycles and cars that had been donated to the program. Evan, Axel Grant's younger brother, was one of the garage's coordinators. His natural charisma and determination had turned him into a trusted leader. He approached Jack with a clipboard in hand, a grin spreading across his face. You're not going to believe this, Evan said, holding up the clipboard. We've got 3 more towns asking to join the program. And the donations, they just keep coming. Jack glanced at the clipboard, nodding. Good work. But don't let it go to your head. It's not about the numbers, it's about the people. Evan chuckled. Yeah, I know. You've only told me 1,000 times. Later that evening, Jack returned to Ridgefield for the first time in weeks. The town had become a shining example of what was possible when a community came together. The shelter was thriving, the diner was as busy as ever, and the people had a renewed sense of pride in their town. Marcus greeted him at the shelter's entrance, a warm smile spreading across his face. Welcome home, he said, pulling Jack into a firm handshake. Jack looked around, his heart swelling with pride. It's good to be back. The 2 men walked through the shelter, observing the progress that had been made. The program had expanded to include vocational training, mental health services, and outreach for at-risk youth. Rachel, the waitress who had first thanked Jack for his actions at the diner, now worked as the shelter's volunteer coordinator. It's amazing what this place has become, Jack said. Marcus nodded. And it all started with you standing up in that diner. Jack shook his head. It started with all of us. I just gave it a push. The next morning, Jack attended a town hall meeting, where the community had gathered to celebrate the success of the program and discuss its future. Sheriff Laura Bennett was there, along with representatives from neighboring towns that had joined the movement. During the meeting, a young woman stood up and introduced herself as the daughter of a former gang member who had gone through the program. With tears in her eyes, She thanked Jack and the Ridgefield team for giving her father a second chance. "He's a different man now," she said. "He's been there for us in ways I never thought possible. None of this would have happened without you." Jack listened quietly, his chest tightening with emotion. Moments like these reminded him why he had chosen to step into the spotlight, despite his reluctance. As the months turned into years, the movement continued to grow. Chapters sprang up across the country, each one tailored to the unique needs of its community. Jack remained at the heart of it, though he often tried to shift the focus away from himself and onto the collective efforts of the people involved. One day, Jack received a letter in the mail. It was from Axel Grant, who was serving time in prison. The letter was unexpected, but as Jack unfolded the paper and began to read, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't anticipated. Hope. "Jack," the letter began, "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night at the shelter. I've made more mistakes than I can count, and I'm not proud of who I've been. But seeing what you've done, seeing my brother and some of the others turn their lives around, it's made me realize that maybe I can change too. I don't know how, but I want to try." Jack folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Redemption wasn't easy, but it was possible, and Axel's words were a testament to the ripple effect of standing up for what was right. Years later, Jack found himself back at Sarah's diner, sitting in the same corner booth where it had all begun. Rachel brought him a cup of coffee, her smile warm and familiar. "You've done a lot of good, Jack," she said softly. Jack nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "So have you." As he looked out the window at the bustling town, Jack allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had spent so much of his life searching for peace, only to find it in the act of helping others. The movement had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, but at its core, it remained the same. A testament to the power of community, the importance of second chances, and the quiet strength of one man who decided to stand up when it mattered most. And it all started with a cup of coffee in a corner booth at Sarah's diner.